Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back, students. Today we are starting our next session, which is about outlining the variables of a research, outlining the measurements, and outlining the sampling plan of a research. So, putting it in the context of what we've discussed already, we are basically discussing the second big rectangle of this diagram, in which the first sub part is selecting the variables, oblique hypothesis. The second sub part is operational definitions, oblique measurements. And the third sub part is plan for sampling and data collection. And in this particular session, we will be discussing only the first sub part, which is select variables oblique hypothesis. Now, before I start our session today, I'd like to quickly give you some explanation or detailed guidance on the assignments 3 and 4 that you've submitted, most of you have submitted. It looks like you need to go through the discussion we had in the last video on the assignment again. Some of you have submitted very elaborate replies, which were actually not required. Some of you have actually conducted half of their research on this assignment only, which was not required. What was required was only, if you look at the slide in front of you, you were only required to do the subparts of the first big rectangle, which is find your research topic, justify your topic, refine it, and select your research questions. And how were they supposed to be expressed? Well, there were only three things to be done. The first, what is your idea, which could be in a crude shape. Then your research question based on that idea, again in a rather refined shape compared to the crude shape, but yet not final. And the third was focused research question. So basically, you were required to submit only 3 sentences and some explanation of how you got to those 3 sentences. So in my reckoning, your assignment should not be more than half to 1 page. Basically, your idea, your rough research question, and your focused research question, and how you arrived at them. And for that, you were required to use the format given in our previous lecture, and you were to arrive at them by going through the steps that we learned in the previous lecture. So please be very focused on the lectures and our discussions when you are submitting assignments. Otherwise, you'll be doing things that are not required, and more importantly, you won't learn what we want to learn in this course. So please go step by step, do the bit size assignments that I give you. I'll never give you large assignments. They'll be very small assignments. Your reply would, well, mostly it won't be required to be more than half a page or a single page. And the idea would be that you practice what you've learned in that particular lecture. It will not be beyond what I've taught you. So please be focused, and remember that our assignments are basically very small bit-size assignments. They're not big, huge assignments. They kind of accumulate over one another. And when at the end of this course you would have done all the assignments, you would have your rough research paper in front of you. So in every assignment, you are doing kind of a paragraph or two of your research paper. Please keep that in mind in your future assignments. And those of you who think they've benefited from what I've just told you, you can actually go back and correct your assignments 3 and 4. All right, so moving on to our topic today. Well, what is a hypothesis? Hypothesis is basically a statement which states your prediction about what your research will produce in the end. It is kind of a tentative answer to your research question. that you made in your last assignment, but this question has not been statistically tested yet, or statistically verified yet, or empirically or scientifically tested or verified yet. Uh, how is it a prediction? Well, it is not an absolute guess. It is based on limited observation or evidence, and it is kind of a starting point for your further investigation. Normally, an hypothesis has some basis on which it stands. Maybe it is your observation, maybe it is the suggestion given by another author when he or she has completed their research. So, uh, a small figment of their future research part, but it is not a complete guess. It is based on some grounds. Normally, when somebody is doing their thesis, MS thesis, they would require uh, quite a few hypotheses. A single hypothesis is usually not found in social sciences and even physical sciences researches. Why? Because data collection these days is pretty easy, and whenever you include a question like what is your age, you are basically researching a mediating variable. So another hypothesis comes in. So usually theses have lots of hypotheses. Okay, so every hypothesis, well, they're not all the same, but there are a few characteristics that a good hypothesis should possess. The first one is testability, and this is the primary feature of a hypothesis. It should be testable. You should be able to measure the components of that hypothesis. Otherwise, it won't be empirical, it won't be scientific, and it would remain just a statement. And if it is in any way not observable, it will be kind of an air castle, which, well, it can be stated very well, but it cannot be proved or tested. Another important aspect of testability is that hypothesis could be disprovable as well, not only provable, but disprovable as well. It should be falsifiable as well. There's no point in stating an hypothesis which just cannot go the opposite way, because then there's no point in researching. You already know that things go in one way only. The second characteristic is relevant to the topic or the problem. Obviously, doesn't need to be elaborated much. It should be focused on the problem that you're researching, on your research question, on the idea that you have, not irrelevant. The third one is specific. Well, what does specific mean? It means it should not be generalized. It should have focus on your topic. For example, businesses in Pakistan is very, very general. Textile business becomes a bit specific. The spinning sector within textile sector becomes more specific, and so on. So the hypothesis should be specific as well. The fourth characteristic is clarity. Well, not only the terminology has to be clear, but the concept has to be clear as well. And what normally happens is that the more knowledge you have about your topic, the more insight you have, the simplicity and clarity that they kind of come automatically. So whenever somebody reads your hypothesis, he or she should quickly understand what you mean, instead of trying to uh, go to dictionaries and expressing their understanding of what you've written, which may be different from your understanding of what you've written. They should clearly understand what you mean. The next one is relevant to available testing tools. Again, this is the practical part of research. You may have very good variables, very good hypothesis, but you don't have the tools to test it. For example, uh, the gravitational force between Sun and Mercury. It is measurable. Again, good hypothesis, maybe a part of a good hypothesis, but can you really measure it? Do you have the tools to measure it? Well, somebody may have the tool. you may not have the tool, so for you that is not a good hypothesis. So make sure that your hypothesis, uh, they lend themselves to good measurement. The next one is fruitful for new discoveries. What does that mean? It means that your hypothesis should provide new suggestions and ways of knowledge. It should not be a trivial thing. It should not be a useless thing. It should be contributing towards the knowledge, towards new discoveries. When somebody looks at your results, that they should realize that you've contributed something instead of doing a fanciful research which has no practical meaning. And finally, consistency and harmony, which means the variables in your uh, hypothesis, they should have no contradictions and no conflicts between them. There should be no confusion between their relationship. So when we look at some examples, we would understand more about this consistency and harmony. But the idea is that the directions of relationship between variables, it should be clear. I'll quickly show you an example of a good hypothesis and a bad hypothesis, and maybe you should be able to grasp more of what we've just studied. Now, the example here, the first column of a good hypothesis, it says aphid infected plants that are exposed to ladybugs will have fewer aphids after a week than aphid infected plants which are left untreated. Well, if you look at this statement, it gives a clear indication of what is to be tested. It is the ability of ladybugs to curb an aphid infestation. It is a manageable size for a single experiment. You can expose a plant to ladybugs and you would know what's the outcome. It mentions the independent variable, which is ladybugs, and the dependent variable, which is the number of aphids. And finally, it predicts the effect. It tells that exposure to ladybugs, it reduces the number of aphids. So it kind of meets all the criteria that we set in the last slide. If you look at the other hypothesis, the poor one, the second column, it says ladybugs are good natural pesticide for treating aphid infected plants. Now, first of all, the statement is not bite size. I mean, people may have different perceptions of it when you show them to different people. Then, good natural pesticide. How do we measure it? Good, natural. So everybody might have a separate perception about these terms. And finally, there's no clear indication of what will be measured. What would you measure? How would you measure good? How would you measure natural? And so on. So the idea is that your hypothesis should be crisp. When somebody looks at your hypothesis, they should, if there's one thing you want to convey to your supervisor or evaluator about your hypothesis, it should be that its components are very much measurable. So that's how a good hypothesis is distinguished from a bad hypothesis. Okay, so this first column, it mentions some variables. So let's see what a variable is. What are variables? A variable is basically a characteristic that is subject to change. It is not a constant. So variable is kind of an antonym, the opposite of constant. The variable can have more than one value, such as age. Age is a variable. Somebody could be 10 years old, another would be 50, 60, and so on. Intelligence is variable. You could have low, high, or medium, or no intelligence at all, or you may be super intelligent. And there are actually scales to measure intelligence, the emotional quotients, the intelligence quotients, and so on. So a variable is, it changes and it can have more than one values. Well, you'll come across a large number of types of variables, which we'll discuss on the next slide. But basically, there are two variables that would come across you very often. One is the independent variable and one is the dependent variable. I'm sure most of you know what they are, but let's have a quick look at the definitions. The independent variables, it is changed by the experimenter, it is controlled by the experimenter. And the experimenter assumes, or the research assumes, that the independent variable influences the dependent variable. In other words, when you change the value of independent variable, the dependent would show some change as well. So what is a dependent variable? That is a variable that you are testing, and it is dependent on the independent variable. It basically responds to the change in independent variable. Well, there are lots and lots of types of variables, and some are absolutely theoretical. Some are very specific to certain subjects. For example, you would find some different variables in psychology, some different variables in linguistics, and so on. There are a few that I'll quickly discuss with you, and for the others, uh, there's a there's a note titled "Types of Variables" on our group, on our Canvas group. You can have a look at that note to understand what different type of variables are. So what we are looking here is four types that I'll quickly tell you. The first one is intervening variable. Well, what are intervening variables? They are processes that are not directly observable, but they link the independent and dependent variables. For example, your success uh, at uh, at a certain thing, or maybe your career, uh, an intervening variable is your education. Can you measure it? Well, if you can, uh, then it doesn't remain intervening. It becomes a kind of a moderator. But your predisposition, how your society and your parents, your environment, they groomed you to become a good businessman. It is an intervening variable and perhaps not measurable. It will be very difficult to measure how well your society treated you when you were a child, how well your parents gave you homeworks and assignments and all that when you were a child. So that kind of thing, which is very difficult to measure, uh, uh, not directly observable. It is an intervening variable, and those variables which can be measured and they are intervening in a way, they are moderators. What is a control variable? Well, since there are many variables in all situations, and we are studying a few only, some of them, if they change, they might disturb your research. So you cannot afford to let them change when you're doing your research. So what you do is you hold them constant. Those variables which you hold constant, or you do not allow them to change during your research, they are called control variables. For example, if you're doing a medical research and you want to see if you feed glucose to a patient, what would be what would their blood sugar be after 2 hours? Then you must control what they eat in those 2 hours. They should not eat anything else, because if they go out and eat samosas and pakoras and stuff, the reading that you get after 2 hours would not reflect what that initial dose of glucose did. So a control variable is which you do not allow to change. And what's an extraneous variable? Well, uh, there are many variables which you simply cannot control. For example, uh, the effect of environment on that patient who was given glucose. Maybe the heat, maybe what he is wearing, maybe his movements, etc. They kind of influences glucose level, but there's no way you can change the environment. Maybe you can, but assuming that you cannot, you do not have an air conditioner in your office, or those kind of thing, then they become extraneous variables. They're not good. They are dangerous because they may damage the validity of your study. Why? Because that blood glucose level that you would measure after 2 hours, it would not be the reflection of the glucose that you fed to the patient initially. So it has kind of damaged your validity. Uh, uh, the second type, moderator, uh, there are many terms that explain moderation and mediation, and I remember we had a discussion on it during our first or second class, and one of the students she she gave some very good definitions of what she thinks these are. So what I've done is I've placed another note in our Canvas group, which is titled Moderation and Mediation. So you must go through that note as well, so you clearly understand what is moderation, mediation, and what are the effects that they have on a particular research. So let's move on. Um, let's look at how variables are placed in an hypothesis. Hypothesis, what it does is basically it proposes a relationship between two or more variables. Uh, in an experiment, what you do is you change the independent variable and you observe the dependent variable. So it's just like you are holding the knob of your fan controller in your hand. You are moving it around, and you are observing how much things move around in your room when you make the fan turn around faster. Do things move around faster as well or not? And when it is slow down, do things settle down as well or not? So what the experimenter is doing, he or she is changing the independent variable, the knob of the levels on the knob of the fan. You are changing them, and you're observing the dependent variables. You're observing the movement of things around in your room. So, for example, if you look at the bottom of the slide, the statement says level of stress influences human behavior. So the dependent variable here is human behavior, and the independent variable is level of stress. What you would do is you would first give low stress to a person, which would be condition A, and then you would give high stress to a person, which would be condition B. Or maybe you won't give it to them, you would observe them under low stress and high stress, and you would see how their behavior changes. So just reiterating again, your uh, your independent variable is the one that you would be changing. You would be giving it various values, and your dependent variable is the one that you would be observing. You won't be changing it, you would be observing it. Now, okay, so moving on to types of hypothesis. Before I discuss the types, let me just reiterate what we discussed at the start of our course. Research methodology course is usually very theory intensive, but what we decided in the start was that we are not going to lend ourselves to focus on the theory part of it. What we'll be doing is uh, the we'll be doing more of the practical part of it, how to conduct a research, how to conduct your research while writing your thesis. So this type of hypothesis is kind of theoretical. I'll quickly go through it, and if you want to read more about it, you can perhaps you can do a Google search, and you'll find 1,000 websites which will tell you what they are. uh, I'll quickly go through it. First, simple and complex. What is simple hypothesis? It has one independent and one dependent variable. What is complex? It has more variables, not just two, not 1 plus 1 plus, but maybe 1, 2 into 1, 3 into 1, 3 into 2, etc. A null hypothesis is which says there's no relationship between variables. The alternative hypothesis or the alternate hypothesis, it says there is a relationship between variables. Empirical hypothesis, well, the term empirical means observation or experiment, and statistical means obviously use of statistics. So what you would come across mostly is that statistical hypotheses would be the ones that can be tested through mathematical statistical tests, and they would mostly be quantitative hypotheses. And empirical, well, quantitative itself is empirical in a way, but there are hypotheses that are not statistical essentially. They can be observed. You can design experiments, but they are not essentially statistical. So those kind of hypotheses are empirical hypotheses. Then there's directional hypothesis and non-directional hypothesis. What does directional mean? It means uh, if I increase A, B increases. So the direction is increase. If I increase A, B decreases. So the direction is decrease. So these kind of hypotheses are directional, and the non-directional ones are which do not show the direction. For example, smoking weed influences health. Uh, does it improve health or does it deteriorate your health? I'm not stating it, I'm just saying it influences health. If I say smoking weed improves health, it is directional. If I say it influences health, it is non-directional. Then there are some definitions of the logical hypothesis. I don't know if there is an illogical hypothesis as well, but there are hundreds of types of hypotheses that you would see in books and internet and around, and some they get really theoretical. I'm not saying that they are useless. They're very useful for people who are actually researching theory, but from a practical perspective, from the perspective of what we are doing in this course, they may not be very critical. Okay, so now let's practically do what we've just learned. What we'll do is we'll try to make an hypothesis or a set of hypotheses for the example that we are studying since the last session. What we did in the last session was that we made a research question, which was the focused research question, which was which financial barriers are being faced by female SME owners in the textile sector. And then we made a thesis statement, which was there are various financial barriers that inhibit women entrepreneurs in Pakistan from starting and sustaining their own businesses in the textile sector. And then we decided upon a topic, which was financial barriers inhibiting sustainability of women-run textile sector SMEs. And by the way, this was your assignment as well for your topic, and you were only supposed to write almost as much as what is written on this slide, and then maybe in a column explaining why you've written this. So if you've done anything more than this, please reconsider what you've submitted. Submit something like what is written on this slide, or even if you've done the first part of this slide, which is idea, research question, and focused research question only, and why you arrived at it, that is good as well. Now let's try to make hypothesis for this research, for this example that we saw in the last lecture. We'll go through 5 steps to do it. The first one would be we'll list the keywords from what was written on the last slide. Then we would identify which of those keywords are variables. Then we would identify which ones I can measure. There are many variables, maybe some of them I can measure, some of them I cannot. So I'll identify which one I can measure. Then I would identify the relationship between those that I can measure. Or maybe even if I cannot, maybe I can identify the relationship. And finally, I'll phrase my hypothesis. Let's quickly do it. First, list the keywords. In our case, the keywords are financial barriers, female SME owners, textile sector SMEs, starting a business, sustaining a business. So you will have similar keywords in your case as well. Then I'm going to identify variables, but remember what is a variable. The definition is given on slide 7. It is something that changes and it can assume various values. So for me, out of the keywords identified in part 1, the variables, the first one is financial barriers. Why is it variable? Because there can be many financial barriers. It could be access to credit, it could be access to bank, it could be so many things. The second one is female SME owners, organismic characteristics, being an organism, what their characteristics, which could be which could be their age, their education, their location, their predisposition. There could be so many things about a particular person that can change. So that's a variable. Then textile sector SME subtype. There could be many subtypes within textile sector. It could be spinning, it could be grey cloth making, it could be stitching, it could be embroidery, it could be so many things again. So it's a variable. And then even sustaining a business is variable. Maybe sustaining means you have achieved the break-even point. Maybe it means you've achieved a certain percentage of profit. Maybe it means you've completed a certain number of years while doing that business. So sustainability can also be measured in different ways. So I've kept that as a variable as well. Now, out of these, how many can I measure? Well, every one of you will have a different answer to it. So just look at whatever variables you identified and see if you can measure them or not. For me, I think I can measure all four of them, because it is just a matter of asking a question to that lady who's running the business. So I can, since I'll make a questionnaire, I can always add another question. So they're all four of them. They are very much measurable for me. Number four, identify their relationship. How is one variable related to the other one? I'll show the relationships on the next slide. And when you are identifying relationships, you would quickly or automatically know what is the type of variable. Is it independent or dependent or moderating or whatever? You'll quickly observe it on the next slide. And finally, once you've identified the relationships, you'll phrase your hypothesis. Now this slide shows it has all the variables written on it, the ones that we identified on the last slide. Let's start from the right side of the slide. Sustaining a business. Now the arrow that comes to it directly is coming from financial barriers. So what I'm essentially saying here is that financial barriers, they influence sustenance of a business. So these two, they they are related to each other, and just by putting the arrow and showing the relationship between them, I have defined whether they are dependent or independent. Sustaining a business becomes a dependent variable, and it is dependent on financial barriers, which is independent variable. Now there are two variables which kind of moderate this relationship. Textile sector subtype. Do the people who work in spinning, do their businesses get affected by financial barriers more than those who are working in the stitching subsector or the embroidery subsector? Well, we don't know, but all we know is that this may influence the relationship. And the one at the bottom, the organismic characteristics, age, education, location, etc., do they affect this relationship? Well, whether they increase or enhance the relationship or decrease it, we don't know yet. But as a researcher, I suspect that they do influence the relationship. So this comes at the bottom. But again, thinking a bit deeply, the textile sector subtype may actually be defining whether financial barriers come in the way or not. Some sectors, they may require so little investment that they just don't face these financial barriers. Again, on the left bottom, there might be some sectors where your organismic characteristics, your age, etc., they may have nothing to do with financial barriers. So what this overthinking has done is that it has kind of made financial barriers itself a dependent variable, and it is dependent on the subtype and the organismic characteristics. So what I'll do is I'll do away with the overthinking, and I'll simplify my well, whatever you see at this slide. I'm not going to name it yet, but I'll remove these two variables that appear in the mediating or moderating part. I've removed them from the behind side of financial barriers. So by removing these two factors affecting financial barriers, what we've done is we've set the boundaries of our research. We have limited our research. Well, they were not bad. That itself might be a very good research. Whether textile subsector type or organismic characteristics of entrepreneurs affect whether they will face financial barriers or not. It may be a very good research, but for me, for this particular circumstance, I've decided to do away with them and I've limited my research, I've set my boundaries. And what I've also done is I have consolidated financial barriers as the independent variable. It is now independent. It is not dependent on anything. Again, a kind of limitation, but at least my research is very crisp. It is very focused, very measurable. Now let's move on and let's try and make hypotheses for them. So this first arrow between financial barriers and sustaining a business, it gives me grounds for my first hypothesis, which would be something like uh, increasing financial barriers would decrease the sustainability of a business, something like this. The second arrow, uh, the one that comes from textile sector subtype to the arrow between financial barriers and sustaining a business, it gives me basis or grounds for my second hypothesis, which could be something like textile sector subtype influences the relationship between the financial barriers and sustaining a business. And similarly, the third arrow, it gives me grounds for my third hypothesis, which would be something like organismic characteristics such as age, education, etc., influences the relationship between financial barriers and sustaining business. So what I'll do is I'll state my hypothesis, I'll refine them, maybe show them to one of my friends or classmates, and make them more crisp, more simple, more clear, more understandable by the readers, and I would come up with my hypothesis statements. So here are the three statements that I have. The first one uh, reflects the main arrow between the independent and dependent variable, and the second two, they reflect the mediating relationships. So these are kind of examples for you, but you'll have to do your own. Well, if you look at this slide, it says hypothesis or research questions. Now, this is kind of the concluding part of our session. So, I want to emphasize that remember, you might find researches that have research questions and no hypothesis. You might find researches that have research questions and hypothesis. You might find researches that have no research questions and only hypothesis. So it depends. It varies from researcher to researcher, from supervisor to supervisor, from university to university, and from discipline to discipline. You may be required to do one, the other, or both. In your case, since we are learning, we'll do both. You have already made your research questions and you'll make your hypothesis out of it. But remember, not everybody does that. It is contingent upon so many things, as I just discussed. Now, what we'll do is well, not we. What you will do is you'll analyze these four hypotheses that I've given on this slide, and you will indicate which of the seven characteristics given in slide 5 are missing. For example, the first hypothesis says if you turn out all the lights, you will fall asleep faster. Well, sounds good, but just a thought that comes to my mind is, will I know when I'm asleep? And when I'm asleep, will I be able to record things? So maybe it is not very much measurable, especially the second part, and so on. So look at these examples. Look at slide 5 and see which characteristics are missing from these